Thank you so much to all of our younger singers today and to all those that work with them on a weekly basis. Though your investment of time and sacrifice and investing in their lives, sincerely, that not just as a pastor, but as part of this church and as a dad, thank you for your investment in their lives. You know, it's interesting how when you're a bit younger, a little bit of knowledge can be kind of dangerous. And by that I mean that you have this particular fact in mind, and so that leads you to some conclusions that may or may not be right. So for example, I remember some years ago I had the boys down fishing at the lake in our neighborhood, and I've never caught one before or since, but I caught an eel on that day, and that is a strange thing to catch. Anyway, I'm pulling this thing up out of the water, and the boys are seeing this for the first time as I'm seeing this for the first time. And I remember Andrew in particular was concerned because he said, "Is it going to shock us?" I mean, which is kind of reasonable because he had heard of eels, but the ones that he'd heard about were electric. But this is not an electric eel. This is just eel. Anyway, there are other times though where, like in my own experience, a little bit of knowledge kind of led me into some wrong conclusions. I was aware early on, for example, that there are certain things, in fact, lots of things that are flammable. And so, for example, alcohol is a flammable substance. I knew that. I was also aware because I had heard that beverages like beer contain alcohol. This posed a real dilemma for me if I went to the bowling alley. And this was back before North Carolina changed its laws with respect to smoking indoors. But I remember, I don't know, it'd be a kids' event or something at church. It used to be, you'd go into a bowling alley, and it's like a speakeasy. You're trying to get through the fog in there. And there's a couple of things that go, actually three things that go on in a bowling alley. There's bowling, there's drinking, and smoking. That was pretty much what was going on. Anyway, and so I remember distinctly seeing somebody that was, they had a beer, and then they lit a cigarette. I'm not lying. I stepped back because I thought, she's going to blow. It got even worse when you would see somebody, they might have this much beer left in the bottom of their cup, and they might be finishing that cigarette off, and they just don't want to drink that much beer that's left, and so then they would take their cigarette and they would drop it in there. I was thinking, what are you doing? What's the matter with you? I mean, I thought this is like shaking nitroglycerin. I mean, what are you doing? And I thought, we're all goners. And strangely, it just extinguished the cigarette. And nothing actually happened. I was surprised by that because alcohol is flammable. Here you have something that is ignited. There should be some sort of fire, a small one at least, I suppose, but I was actually wrong. You know, there are frequent instances where our experiences surprise us, where we have this certain thought in our mind, and then because of that, we anticipate that X is going to happen, and then we discover, well, no, what we actually thought was wrong. We are working our way towards not just the crucifixion, but towards the resurrection story of Jesus. And we've been doing this in Luke's gospel by paying attention to some of the conversations that he had with people in a series that we've been calling Overheard. And it's as if we get to overhear these conversations that people have with Jesus. And today we're going to see a conversation that takes place between Jesus and Peter. And what we see is Jesus is talking to Peter and Peter is responding. There were some thoughts that Peter had in his mind that he just thought or just knew this is how it is, but what he thought was actually wrong. Now, what Peter struggled with are some of the same things that may be something that you might struggle with, that I might struggle with. So what are these faulty assumptions? So we're going to look at today Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, as it helps us answer this question, what are some common false spiritual assumptions that we may make? Luke 22, starting with verse 31, Jesus is talking to Peter. He doesn't call him Peter here. Instead, he calls him Simon. He says, "Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Lord, Peter told him, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you deny me, until you deny 3 times that you know me. Peter was operating with some false assumptions about his spiritual condition that you might operate as well. Stuff you just know. And the first thing that Peter assumed that you might also assume is this: my faith commitment will never waver. My faith commitment will never waver. At this point in Luke's gospel, it is very late in the life and the ministry of Jesus. In fact, we are in the final hours of what are going to be freedom for Jesus. It was a week that started on what we celebrate today, Palm Sunday. And Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding on the back of a donkey. Matthew tells us that Jerusalem is just insanely excited, that the city shook with excitement and anticipation because Jesus is there. And people are waving palm branches. They're shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And everyone is so excited except the religious establishment. And they're thinking, oh, this is the worst possible scenario. We've got Jerusalem filled for a Passover celebration. Everybody's here, and it looks like everybody is on Team Jesus. We can't have that. We can't have this week end and Jesus leave Jerusalem with his star rising even higher. Something has to be done. And they have been conspiring for some time, trying to figure out some way to get rid of Jesus because he, they think, is a threat to their traditions. He is a threat to their way of life. And so they have been working, and they've been trying to trap Jesus a stack of different ways, but finally they're able to conspire with one of his own to have Judas betray Jesus to them. They've negotiated even a price already. And so this week that starts on Palm Sunday, with everybody being excited, by the time we get to here, we are on Thursday night, and Jesus has just celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples, and in a matter maybe of hours, Jesus is getting ready to be arrested. Now, what we have here in this conversation, there's no certainty as to when exactly this takes place. And by that I mean we don't know, does this occur while they are still or on the heels of them having just finished the Last Supper or celebrating the Passover meal? Or is this on the way to Gethsemane where Jesus is going to be praying? We don't know, but it seems to me, and I could be wrong about this, it seems to me as though Jesus pulls Peter aside and says what we read here to him. And he says to him, in verse 31, he starts by calling his name, and he calls him Simon. Well, that kind of makes sense that he would call him Simon. That was the name he received at birth. But this is unusual because for some time now, they haven't been calling, and Jesus has not been calling him Simon. He's been calling him the name, and others have been calling him the name that we know him as, the name that Jesus gave him, Peter, a name that means rock. But he's getting ready to talk to a guy who's getting ready to stumble. And he doesn't call him Rock. He calls him his given name, Simon. But then he repeats it. I hope you're aware that generally speaking, if people repeat your name, probably not so good. Maybe you're in trouble. Maybe you're not paying attention. Maybe, typically, it's not repeating your name and saying you've won something. All right? So Jesus repeats his name, and he says this: Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. Now, this is kind of interesting. Satan has asked? I mean, did Satan all of a sudden go to finishing school and learn manners? I mean, like he is politely, what's going on here? What's this whole notion about Jesus asking, or excuse me, Satan asking? What I'm getting ready to say is based on some scant details. And I reserve the right to be wrong, but I believe this to be the reasonable response to what we read here. When we have this notion that Satan has asked, which means to gain permission to do something to Peter, to do something to Simon, where does that come from? Hopefully you're aware of the fact that Satan was not always a bad guy. That Satan started off as not just an angel, but one of the chief angels. And things had been going so well until Satan decides, or Lucifer at this point decides, you know what? I'm tired of being a number two. I think I could sit in the big chair. I think I could be the one that would be calling the shots. The one that's sitting on the throne, that could be me. And so what he does is to work with other angels to say, you know what, you ought to get on Team Lucifer. And they seek to revolt. They seek to launch a coup and elevate Lucifer to be in the position of God. Of course, that does not happen. Satan, Lucifer, is cast out of heaven along with a third of the angels. All right. Satan is headed, and his demons are headed for hell. But they're not there yet. They weren't there then. They aren't there yet even now. So what's all this that Satan has asked to be able to sift you? Well, I think if you look at a passage back in Job chapter 1, and I don't know if you remember this, but it's around verse 6 or 7, that we're told that the angels, we're told that the angels have come essentially to report in, and they are coming to describe what it is that they have been doing. We're told that Satan appears before the Lord, and God asks this question. He says, where have you been? And he says, I've been searching. I have been looking throughout the whole earth. And you remember that God says, have you considered my servant Job? What's going on in that passage? This is, in summary, what I believe. Even though Satan rebelled against God, even though he was cast out of heaven, and even though he is headed for hell, he's not there yet. And even though he is the enemy of God and all those that are connected with the Lord, I believe that it is the case that he has not been given free rein. He has not been offered a free check, a blank check. It's as if you turned an animal loose in the backyard, but the fence is still there. And as Luther said, Satan is still God's Satan. There hasn't been a moment since the rebellion of Lucifer that God has lost control, that somehow he has ceded the ability to reign even his arch nemesis in. And so when Jesus tells Peter that Satan has asked for, that he has sought permission, that he's wanting to sift you like wheat, which is to shake you up and to really put you through the tumblers, he says something very encouraging. Satan has asked to do this, but I want you to know that I, Jesus, God the Son, I have been praying for you. And he says what? He says, I have prayed for you. He says that your faith may not fail. That your commitment to me, that your commitment to the cause of God, that there might not be any stress fractures, that it might not collapse, that it might not fail. But then he says that when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. When you've turned back, what is that suggesting? Well, it's suggesting, it's not just a implication, it is predicting you're going to fail. You're going to stumble. Because to be able to turn back, you had to fall. But look at Peter's response in verse 33. He says, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Ain't no mountain high enough. There's nothing that can stop me. I am absolutely full throttle, full bore, absolutely 100 teetotal % connected to and committed to you, and there's nothing that is ever going to happen that would ever cause me to back away from that. There's nothing that would ever cause me to have cracks in that commitment. That would never, ever happen. Peter protests this, and he's saying it really doesn't make any difference what actually occurs. I'll never have a wavering in my commitment to you. If that costs me my freedom, so be it. If it costs me my life, so be it. But I'm with you, period. And Jesus says, you're going to do this 3 times before the sun rises. Now, why did Peter ever say something like this? Well, it's because his assumption was based on 2 notions. One, that he was really strong, and secondly, that his enemy was really weak. And so Jesus is informing him, listen, the enemy has you in his crosshairs, and I am praying for you and for the strength of your faith. But Peter's like, no, I've got this. I've got this. Nothing's going to happen. No cracks, no failures, no stumbles, no falls. Over the years, I have, not because I'm a plumber by any stretch, but if you want to save a little bit of money, you got to do a little bit of plumbing in your house from time to time. And so I've done a fair amount of stuff, whether changing faucets out or putting in a sink or changing toilets or that type of thing. Nothing huge, but doing some plumbing. And with that experience, there's a couple of things I've learned. The first is, if you're going to Home Depot or Lowe's to buy your plumbing supplies, if you're looking at this particular part and it comes in 2 sizes or 3, buy them all. Buy all of them. Because what will happen invariably, if you buy the one that you think it is, that's not the right one. In fact, maybe what you should do is to think, which one is the least likely? Which one will not work? And buy that one. But what I do now is I buy all of them, and that way I'm trying to reduce the number of trips. And so once I finish, I take back the parts that I didn't need. So I have learned that. I've also learned this. Turn the water on before you put your tools away. Various numbers of times, at least early on, I would have done something and I would think, did that right. Took my time, I was careful. Wrap that Teflon tape on there, that nut is tight. This bad boy is good. I finished, I'm done. Let me go ahead and clean up. Put my tools away, get the bathroom, get the kitchen, get that cleaned up. Oh, need to turn the water on. Drip. Drip, drip. And I'm shocked because I did that right. Until it comes under pressure. Until it comes under pressure, and then I see, hey, we've got a problem. Listen, too many times we can operate exactly like that, plumbing that is untested. And at this point, though Peter has experienced some pushback, he's not at all experienced what he's getting ready to go through. And in advance of that, he's, it's not going to happen. Absolutely, I've got this. I can put the tools away, Jesus. This plumbing job is done. And Jesus says the water's getting ready to come on, and you're going to have 3 big leaks. But Peter thought, that's not going to happen. False spiritual assumption. My faith commitment will never waver. Listen, every one of us is subject to having some stress fractures. Every one of us is subject to experiencing a failure. Every one of us is subject where it's not impossible that we could even walk away for a season. And if you think it can't happen to you, that's exactly what Satan wants. That's exactly what your enemy wants. He wants for you to overestimate yourself and to underestimate him. Because if that can happen, he's got you. He's got you. What are some common false spiritual assumptions we may make? My faith commitment will never waver. And here's the other one we see from this passage. Jesus has redeemed me. God has redeemed me from my past. God has redeemed me from my past. Now you hear that and you're like, wait a minute, Michael, what are you talking about? A false statement. That's a true statement. Well, it is, except it's not the whole truth. It's not the whole truth. Especially as we approach the crucifixion of Christ and you're working your way through the Gospels and you're approaching what's going to happen ultimately on this Thursday night and finally on Friday. Nothing, not one detail, not one iota of activity that occurs and catches God by surprise. Every bit of everything that is transpiring or will transpire is part of the knowledge of and part of the plan of God. And when he tells Peter that Satan has swung the turret around and is aiming at him, he says something profoundly comforting to Peter. He says, listen, I'm praying for you. I'm praying for you that your faith may not fail. But it's also clear that Jesus knows what's getting ready to happen. Peter's failure is not going to surprise him because he says, in fact, I've prayed that when you've turned back, you'll strengthen your brothers. Talking about the other disciples. Peter says, no, that's not going to happen, fat chance. And Jesus says, hey, it's going to happen 3 times before morning. Notice that Jesus says something at the end of verse 32 when he says, I'm praying that when you have turned back, you may strengthen your brothers. There's a couple of positive and wonderfully encouraging thoughts in that statement. One of them is that Jesus is predicting the failure of Peter. He's saying, you're going to walk away. He's saying, you're going to deny even having any connection, any knowledge of me whatsoever. But then he follows that by describing, this is how I still want to use you. That ought to come as wonderfully comforting news to me and wonderfully comforting news to you if you're a follower of God, that while it is true that he has called us to perfect obedience, that's the standard, he knows that we're not going to meet it. He knows that we're never going to get 100 on the test. But here's the good thing. He doesn't say get out. He doesn't say that it's 1 strike and you're done. In fact, he says to Peter that when you come back, I've got something for you. And then, notice what he says. I want you to strengthen your brothers. Jesus knows what's getting ready to happen. The plan of God even involves, and God has taken into account Peter's failures. But look at this. Jesus is saying, I even want to use your failures. The fact that you're going to deny me, the fact that you're going to walk away, I want to even use that. This reminds us of a simple yet profound truth. With God, there is nothing that is wasted. Certainly not successes, certainly not victories, but even our failures are not wasted with God. I am a big fan of smoked meats, and so if it's a pork shoulder or a ham, a butt, or whatever it is that you... Man, I love some barbecue. I think I would eat a charcoal briquette. I really do. I just love that smoked flavor. And in recent years, I've really developed a deep and meaningful appreciation for brisket. And it's interesting. Brisket, it comes off of a cow. And for the longest time, the brisket was a hunk of meat, in fact, a large hunk of meat, that was a throwaway. This was something you could buy crazy cheap. But if you go to a barbecue restaurant now or anywhere that may serve brisket, it's very likely that might be the most expensive item on the menu, at least among the meats. Why is that? I'll answer it with one word: Texas. Texas discovered, you know what? You can't treat that like a normal cut of meat. You don't cook it like a steak, quick and hot. You cook it low and slow. And this otherwise very fatty, tough piece of meat, that fat begins to render, and that meat gets so tender, and it picks up this amazing smoked flavor, and all of a sudden people are thinking, God bless Texas. Why? Because they discovered that the end result is shaped by responding differently to it. You don't treat it like a steak, you treat it like a brisket. Listen, God doesn't treat my failures as though they are successes. He treats them like they're failures. But what could be a waste, he doesn't use as a waste. What he does is to redeem them. He redeems them. Now, that's a word that has found its way with some frequency into our vocabulary in the life of the church. Certainly, at least historically, had been a word that was used a great deal in our hymns. I remember as a kid learning, redeemed how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. We use that word, redemption draweth nigh. We use redeem with some frequency, but a lot of times what we will do is use the term in the absence of thinking about what it means. And I think one of the best ways to think about what it means is to realize this, that when I am redeeming something, I'm taking something of little to no value and redeeming it, exchanging it for something of actual value. Now, it's the case if you go to Moses Cone Hospital or you go to Wesley Long, both of them offer valet parking. if you're a patient or if you're going to visit someone. I've never taken advantage of it, but maybe you have. And how that works, very simple. You pull up to where they've got the desk, and you give them your keys. They give you a slip of paper, and then they leave with your car. You might not want to do that at Walmart today. Though someone may likely take you up on that offer. But it's interesting, you go pay your visit, and then you come outside, you give them a piece of paper. And you know what they give you? They give you a car. Well, what's that paper worth? Nothing. It's effectively worthless, except that it is redeemed for something of value. Listen, that's how God works with our failures. And hear me in this. I'm not suggesting, well, let me see if I can screw up this week and just see what God does. I'm not endorsing this. I'm just helping us and reminding me as well that failures, unfortunately, are going to be a part of our story. But too many times what we can do is this. We will think about the redemption that we have experienced, the activity of God in redeeming me as being something that just happened when He saved me. That God redeemed me from my past. Now, that is true, but the problem is if we think about redemption as occurring only back then, only back there, do you know what happens? When we screw up again, we think, well, I guess I better go head to the bench. But listen, God can take even currently and in the future my failures and use them for beneficial purposes. It's not that God celebrates what Peter is getting ready to do. It's not that Jesus is saying, bravo, Peter, great job denying me. I have no idea who that guy is. He's not praising him for that, but what he's saying is this, that He can take even your failures and use them for His ultimate good. Reminds us that Paul was so correct when he said that God uses all things and causes them to work together for good. Not just our wins, not just the victories, but even the losses, even the failures. Yes, it is that God has redeemed me from my past, but that's not the whole truth. God can even redeem my failures now. God can even redeem my failures tomorrow. So what do we do with this? What's the use even in considering this? What are our takeaways? All of this is beneficial because, and we need to be reminded of this, Satan is real. And he has you, he has me, he had Peter in his sights. And if you have begun a relationship with Christ, he can't stop that. But what he can do is to seek to make you as absolutely ineffective and miserable as possible. He wants you off the field and headed towards the bench. And maybe one of the ways that he can get you to do that is to think, oh, no, I will not, failure would never, ever, ever happen to me. And so if he can convince you of that and get you to think, oh, that's the absolute truth, when failure does come, you just head off the field, dismissing yourself from use. But what I want you to see is that God can take even that stumble, even that failure, and use them for positive kingdom purposes. But I thought that eel would shock me. No. I thought that beer would blow up. No. But I thought that God couldn't use a failure. I thought I wouldn't fail. Wrong. But God can even use broken failures. Will you bow your heads with me?